Before she died, Vivien Leigh did not leave the world with a loud confession. There was no grand final interview, no dramatic scene where she gathered everyone around and named the man who had owned her heart. But sometimes, the truth of a life is not found in one sentence. Sometimes it is found in the letters left behind, the memories people could not forget, the way one name kept returning long after the marriage was over. And in Vivien Leigh's story, that name was Laurence Olivier. Vivien Leigh had been adored by millions, yet few people truly knew how lonely her fame could become. To the public, she was Scarlett O'Hara, the woman with fire in her eyes and pride in every breath. She was Blanche Dubois, fragile, haunted, unforgettable. She was beauty, elegance, danger, and mystery wrapped into one face. But behind the camera, behind the applause, behind the carefully lit photographs, Vivien was a woman who wanted something much simpler than immortality. She wanted to be loved completely. And that was where Laurence Olivier entered her life. When Vivien first saw him, it was not just admiration, it was recognition. Olivier was already considered one of the great actors of his generation, a man with stage power, discipline, and a kind of masculine magnetism that made people turn their heads. Vivien, married at the time and already a mother, should have kept her distance. Olivier, too, had a life of his own. But love rarely asks permission before it begins destroying everything carefully built around it. Their attraction was immediate, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. It was not the quiet kind of love that waits patiently in the background. It was consuming. It pulled them away from their old lives and into a romance that looked, from the outside, like destiny. Two beautiful actors, two ambitious souls, two people who believed they were meant not only to love each other, but to conquer the stage and screen together. For a time, they did. Vivien and Laurence became one of the most glamorous couples in the world. When they stood side by side, they looked almost unreal, as if Hollywood had invented them for publicity. But their bond was never just about beauty. Vivien worshipped Olivier's talent. Olivier was fascinated by Vivien's intensity. She could be charming one moment and devastating the next. She had the kind of emotional force that made people feel chosen when she looked at them. And Olivier, for many years, was the center of that force. But the very passion that made their love unforgettable also made it unbearable. Vivien's life was marked by illness, emotional storms, and periods of deep instability. In those days, people did not understand mental health with the compassion and knowledge we have now. Her pain was often treated as scandal, weakness, or madness. Olivier tried, failed, stayed, left, returned emotionally, and suffered in ways even he later struggled to explain. Their marriage became a battlefield between devotion and exhaustion. Love was still there, but love alone could not save them. That is the part people often forget. The tragedy of Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier was not that they stopped loving each other. It was that love became too wounded to survive daily life. By 1960, their marriage was over. Olivier married Joan Plowright. Vivien found companionship with John Merivale, a gentle and loyal man who cared for her during her final years. Merivale gave her calm. He gave her protection. He gave her kindness when the world had already taken so much. But even with him beside her, the shadow of Olivier never truly disappeared. That is why the question still haunts her story. Who was the love of Vivien Leigh's life? The easy answer is Laurence Olivier. The complicated answer is that Olivier was not only her great love, but also her great wound. He was the man who made her feel most alive, and perhaps the man whose absence she never fully escaped. Their romance had been too bright to end cleanly. It burned into both of them. When Vivienne died in 1967, she was only 53. The world mourned a screen legend, but Olivier mourned something far more personal. He went to her home after her death and paid his respects. Whatever had happened between them, whatever bitterness, guilt, distance, or regret had gathered over the years, he still came. That final gesture said what gossip could never fully capture. Vivienne Leigh's life was not a fairy tale. It was not simply a romance between two stars. It was a story of ambition, beauty, illness, longing, betrayal, loyalty, and memory. And before the end, whether in words, letters, silence, or the emotional evidence she left behind, one truth remained difficult to deny. The world may have loved Vivienne Leigh as Scarlett, but Vivienne Leigh's heart never completely escaped Laurence Olivier. To understand why Laurence Olivier remained so powerful in Vivienne Leigh's story, you have to go back to the beginning, before the illness became public, before the marriage cracked, before fame turned their private pain into public fascination. You have to see them as they once saw each other, not as broken legends, but as two people standing at the edge of a life they believed would be magnificent. Vivienne was not yet the tragic figure people would later describe. She was young, beautiful, sharp, ambitious, and far more determined than many people around her understood. She had the face of a delicate woman, but inside her was a will that could frighten even the strongest men. She did not simply want to be admired. She wanted to be taken seriously. She wanted the stage. She wanted cinema. She wanted greatness. And when she saw Olivier, she saw not only a man she desired, but a world she wanted to enter. Olivier represented everything she dreamed of. He was theater. He was discipline. He was prestige. He had the respect of serious actors and the attention of audiences. To Vivienne, loving him was not separate from wanting to become extraordinary. He was the man, the mirror, the challenge, and the prize. But Vivienne was already married to Lee Holman when her feelings for Olivier began to take over her life. Holman had given her stability, a respectable home, and a daughter, Suzanne. Yet stability was not enough to hold a woman whose heart was already racing towards something more dangerous. Vivienne did not move through life softly when she wanted something. She moved with absolute focus. And once Olivier became the center of that focus, almost nothing could stop her. Olivier was also married to actress Jill Esmond. He was not free either. That made the romance more complicated, more painful, and more scandalous. In another life, perhaps they would have stepped back. Perhaps they would have chosen duty. Perhaps they would have buried the attraction and let time do its work. But Vivienne and Olivier were not built for half feelings. Their love did not behave like a passing temptation. It became a force. The scandal could have destroyed them. Instead, for a while, it seemed to make them more determined. They were two people willing to pay a high price just to stand beside each other. Friends saw the intensity. Colleagues felt it. The public would eventually become fascinated by it. Their romance had the quality of a performance, but the pain underneath it was real. Then came Gone with the Wind. Vivienne Leigh's casting as Scarlett O'Hara changed everything. She had fought for that role with a kind of certainty that seemed almost impossible. Hollywood had searched for its Scarlett, and somehow this British actress stepped into the part as if she had been born for it. The world saw the fire, the charm, the stubbornness, the hunger, the heartbreak. they saw Scarlett. But those who knew Vivian saw something else, too. They saw a woman proving she could become immortal. The film made her a global star. It gave her an Oscar. It made her face unforgettable. But it also created a strange imbalance in her life with Olivier. Vivian had achieved a level of screen fame that even he could not ignore. Olivier was a giant of the stage, respected, admired, praised. But suddenly, Vivian belonged to the entire world. That kind of fame can poison even a great love. At first, their marriage looked like the union of two legends. In 1940, after years of longing and complication, they finally married. To outsiders, it seemed like the ending of a romantic film. The two lovers had survived scandal, distance, careers, and judgment. Now they were together. Now everything should have become peaceful. But real life had no interest in giving Vivian Leigh a peaceful ending. Behind the glamour, cracks were already forming. Vivian's emotional highs and lows became harder to manage. Her health suffered. Her work demands were brutal. The world wanted her to remain perfect, beautiful, witty, glowing, and desirable. But perfection is a cruel prison. And Vivian, who had once seemed so fiercely in control, began to struggle against forces no one around her fully understood. Olivier loved her, but love did not make him all-knowing. He could be devoted, but also cold. He could be protective, but also impatient. He admired her brilliance, but feared the chaos that sometimes came with it. And Vivian, in return, loved him with an intensity that could become suffocating. She wanted his approval, his attention, his admiration. When he pulled away, even slightly, it wounded her deeply. Their marriage became a place where genius and pain lived in the same room. On stage, they could still be magnificent. Together, they had electricity. Audiences saw chemistry. Critics saw talent. But behind the curtain, the emotional cost grew heavier. The love story that once felt like destiny began to feel like a storm that neither of them knew how to leave. And that is the heartbreaking part. Vivian did not stop loving Olivier when life became difficult. In some ways, difficulty made her cling to the love even more. He was not just her husband. He was the man she had risked everything for. To admit the marriage was breaking was to admit that the great gamble of her life might not end in triumph. So she held on. She held on through illness, through jealousy, through distance, through professional pressure, through moments when the world applauded her while her private life quietly collapsed. She held on because, for Vivian, Olivier was never just a chapter. He was the man who made the whole story feel written in fire. But the more Vivian Leigh became a legend, the more her real life seemed to slip further away from control. Fame did not protect her. Beauty did not protect her. Talent did not protect her. Even love, the thing she had risked everything to claim, could not protect her from the private storms that were beginning to define her life. To the public, Vivian and Lawrence still looked untouchable. They were photographed like royalty. They entered rooms with the kind of presence that made people whisper. Olivier had the authority of a great classical actor. Vivian had the fragile glamour of a woman who seemed almost too luminous to be real. Together, they looked like proof that talent and romance could survive anything. But inside the marriage, the balance was changing. Vivian wanted Olivier with a devotion that could be tender one moment and desperate the next. His approval mattered to her more than almost anyone else's. A compliment from him could lift her. A cold word from him could destroy her for days. And Olivier, who was already carrying the pressure of his own career, began to feel the weight of being not only her husband, but her anchor, her judge, her comfort, and sometimes the target of her pain. That was too much for any marriage to carry. During the years that followed Gone with the Wind, Vivienne tried to prove that she was not merely a beautiful screen star. She wanted to stand beside Olivier in the serious world of theater. She wanted critics to respect her the way they respected him. She wanted to earn her place not through beauty, but through craft. And in many ways, she did. She was not a decorative actress. She had instinct, intelligence, courage, and emotional truth. But the same sensitivity that made her performances unforgettable also made ordinary life harder to survive. Then came another role that seemed almost too close to her own spirit. Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire. Blanche was not Scarlett. Scarlett fought the world with pride and hunger. Blanche was something more delicate, more wounded, more exposed. She was a woman trying to hide her damage under manners, fantasy, and fading beauty. When Vivienne played Blanche, audiences were stunned. She did not simply act the role. She seemed to disappear into it. The performance won her another Oscar and confirmed her greatness. But it also left a shadow. Some roles demand too much from the person playing them. Blanche required Vivienne to enter emotional territory that was already dangerously close to her own pain. People later wondered whether the role harmed her, whether it blurred the line between performance and suffering. The truth is more complicated. Vivienne was a brilliant actress, not a victim of a single character. But Streetcar showed the world something it had perhaps not wanted to see. Beneath the beauty was a woman who understood collapse, and Olivier saw it too. Their marriage continued, but the tenderness was increasingly mixed with fear. Vivienne's illness became harder to ignore. There were public incidents, private breakdowns, disappearances into despair, and moments of behavior that people around her struggled to explain. In an age when mental illness was often misunderstood and poorly treated, she was judged in ways that now feel cruel. Instead of being fully seen as a sick woman who needed care, she was often treated as difficult, stable, embarrassing, or dangerous to reputations. Olivier did not abandon her immediately. That would be too simple and too unfair. He stayed for years. He carried burdens people outside the marriage never saw. He witnessed the woman he loved become someone he could not always reach. He was frightened, exhausted, and sometimes emotionally brutal because he did not know how else to survive it. Their love became a cycle of rescue and retreat. She needed him. He needed distance. The more he pulled away, the more wounded she became. The more wounded she became, the more he pulled away. This was not the glamorous love story audiences imagined. It was a marriage slowly being crushed by pressure, illness, ambition, and disappointment. Vivienne had once believed that loving Olivier would complete her. Instead, she found herself living with the terrifying truth that even the greatest love of her life could not make her whole. And yet, she could not simply stop loving him. That is what makes her story so haunting. People often talk about love as if it is measured by happiness. But some loves are measured by how long they remain after happiness is gone. Olivier remained in Vivienne's heart not because he gave her peace, but because he had become part of the deepest architecture of her life. He was connected to her rise, her risks, her glory, her shame, her hunger, and her heartbreak. By the late 1950s, the marriage was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a house filled with ghosts while both of them were still alive. Olivier began moving emotionally toward another woman, Joan Plowright, who represented something different. Calm, youth, renewal, a way out. Vivian knew it. Even when no one said everything openly, she felt the distance. For a woman whose emotional world already trembled under rejection, that knowledge was devastating. The great love story was ending, but not cleanly. Because love does not always die when a marriage ends. Sometimes it remains behind, like a stain on the walls. Sometimes it follows both people into the next chapter. Sometimes it becomes the thing neither one can fully admit, because admitting it would mean admitting how much was lost. Vivian Leigh had won Oscars, conquered Hollywood, and stood beside one of the most respected actors in the world. But behind all of it, she was facing the cruelest realization of her life. The man she loved most might still care for her, but he could no longer stay. When Laurence Olivier finally began to leave Vivian Leigh behind, it was not only the end of a marriage. It was the collapse of the one dream Vivian had once believed could survive every scandal, every sacrifice, every wound. She had lost roles before. She had lost peace before. She had lost control over her health, her reputation, even her own image in the newspapers. But losing Olivier was different. It felt like losing the person she had become in order to love him. For years, Vivian had built her life around the idea that she and Olivier were one of those rare couples history would remember. Not simply two actors married to each other, but two names joined by destiny. They had fought through public judgment to be together. They had risked families, reputations, and careers. They had carried the heat of a forbidden romance into a marriage the world could not stop watching. To Vivian, all that suffering had to mean something. It had to lead somewhere. It had to prove that their love was greater than the damage it caused. But real life does not always reward sacrifice. By the time Olivier's heart moved toward Joan Plowright, Vivian already knew the marriage had become fragile. She could feel the change in the smallest details. The delayed replies, the colder tone. The way attention that once belonged to her now drifted elsewhere. For someone who loved as intensely as Vivian did, distance was never just distance. It was humiliation. It was abandonment. It was proof that the thing she feared most was happening in front of her eyes. Olivier did not simply fall out of her daily life. He became emotionally unreachable. That may have hurt more than any public separation. Because even before the divorce, Vivian was already grieving him. She was grieving the man who had once looked at her as if she were the most dazzling woman in the world. She was grieving the early passion, the dangerous letters, the stolen moments, the belief that they had been chosen for something extraordinary. She was grieving a version of herself, too, the young woman who had dared to destroy convention because she believed love would be worth the cost. Now she had to face the question no one around her could answer. What happens when the great love of your life survives only as memory? The divorce came in 1960. Olivier married Joan Plowright soon after. For the public, it became another chapter in the lives of famous people. The gossip moved quickly. The headlines found new angles. The world watched, whispered, judged, and then moved on. But Vivian could not move on in the same way. Her wounds were not shaped for public convenience. They did not heal because newspapers had finished with the story. And yet, this is where Vivian's final chapter becomes more complicated than simple tragedy. Because after Olivier, there was John Merivale. Merivale was not Olivier, and he never tried to be. He did not carry the same mythic force. He was not the thunderstorm that had once rearranged Vivian's entire life. Instead, he brought something quieter, something perhaps more necessary in her later years. He brought steadiness, patience, protection, a gentler kind of loyalty. He understood that loving Vivian meant standing beside a woman the world had already misunderstood too many times. In another story, that would have been enough to rewrite the ending. The wounded woman finds peace with a man who treats her kindly. The old love fades. The final companion becomes the true love. But Vivian Leigh's heart was never that simple, and neither was her history. Merivale may have given her comfort, but Olivier remained the name carved deepest into the legend. It was not that Vivian could not care for another man. She could. She was capable of warmth, gratitude, affection, and dependence. But Olivier had occupied the most dramatic, defining space in her life. He was linked to who she had been when she was at her most beautiful, most ambitious, most reckless, and most alive. He was there in the years when she became Scarlet, when she became a world icon, when she believed the future was still something she could command. That is why people still ask about him when they speak of her final years. Because the love of a life is not always the person who brings the most peace. Sometimes it is the person who changes the shape of the entire life. Olivier did that to Vivian. He altered her destiny. He inspired her, wounded her, challenged her, abandoned her, and remained unforgettable. No gentle later companionship could erase the force of that. Still, Vivian tried to keep living. She continued to work when her health allowed it. She remained glamorous in public, witty in conversation, magnetic in rooms where people still wanted to see the legend. But the body was growing tired. Tuberculosis, which had haunted her before, returned with brutal force. Her emotional struggles continued. The woman who had once seemed unstoppable was now moving through life with increasing fragility. And yet, even in fragility, she retained something extraordinary. People who met Vivian in those later years often remembered not only her beauty, but her presence. She could still make a room feel charged. She could still turn a simple conversation into something theatrical and intimate. She had the rare gift of making people feel that behind her smile was an entire world of secrets. Some of those secrets belonged to the stage, some belonged to cinema, but the deepest ones belonged to love. By the time she reached the end of her life, Vivian Leigh had already become a myth. But myths are often cruel to the people trapped inside them. The myth said she was Scarlet, fierce and unbreakable. The truth was that she had broken many times. The myth said she was a goddess of beauty. The truth was that beauty had not spared her from loneliness. The myth said she lived a grand romance with Laurence Olivier. The truth was harsher. She had loved him. She had lost him. And even after losing him, some part of her story still belonged to him. In the final years of Vivian Leigh's life, there was a strange silence around her. Not because people had forgotten her. They could never forget her. Her face was already part of cinema history. Her name still carried the glow of old Hollywood, the power of the stage, the shock of beauty that did not seem to fade even when illness had begun to weaken her body. But the world's attention had changed. The headlines no longer treated her as the woman at the center of a blazing romance. They treated her as a legend from another era, someone whose brightest fire belonged to the past. That may have been one of the cruelest things for Vivian to endure. She had never been a woman built to simply fade away. Everything about her life had been intense. Her ambition, her love, her performances, her pain, even her charm. She did not enter history quietly. She conquered it. And yet, as the 1960s moved forward, Vivian found herself living in the shadow of what she had once been. Scarlett O'Hara still belonged to the world. Blanche Dubois still haunted the screen. But Vivian herself was increasingly fragile, living between work, illness, memory, and the private ache of what had been lost. John Merivale stood beside her with devotion. He was there when the lights were not flattering, when the myth could not protect her, when the great actress was simply a tired woman trying to keep going. His loyalty deserves to be remembered because it was not glamorous in the way the public understood glamour. It was quieter. It was practical. It was the kind of love that shows up when there are no cameras and no applause. But the public imagination still returned to Olivier. That was not fair to Merivale, but it was inevitable. Vivian and Olivier had been too dramatic, too famous, too beautiful, too wounded together. Their love had left behind the kind of emotional evidence that audiences could not resist. Even after the marriage ended, people continued to look at their story as if there must have been one final secret hidden inside it. Did she still love him? Did he still regret her? Did they ever truly escape each other? Did Vivian, before the end, admit that Laurence Olivier had been the love of her life? The answer depends on what kind of truth someone is searching for. If truth means a final dramatic statement, then no one can honestly claim a perfect scene that proves everything. But if truth means the emotional pattern of a life, then the answer becomes harder to avoid. Olivier remained central, not because he was always kind, not because he brought her lasting peace, not because their marriage was healthy or simple. He remained central because he had been the man around whom so much of her emotional history turned. Vivian's love for Olivier had never been ordinary. It had been mixed with ambition, admiration, desire, dependence, rivalry, and a need so deep that it sometimes frightened the people who witnessed it. She did not simply love him as a husband. She loved him as a symbol of the world she wanted to conquer. She loved him as the man who had seen her before she became fully mythic. She loved him as the partner beside whom she believed she could become immortal. And for a while, she did. But immortality is lonely. The more Vivian became an icon, the less room there seemed to be for the vulnerable woman behind the icon. Audiences wanted Scarlett's fire, Blanche's fragility, the perfect face in the perfect photograph. They did not want the complicated reality of a woman battling illness, heartbreak, fear, and exhaustion. They did not want to know that beauty could suffer. They did not want to know that a legend could feel abandoned. Olivier knew that woman better than most. That was part of the tragedy. He had seen not only the goddess, but the damage. He had loved the brilliance and endured the storms. He had also reached a point where he could no longer live inside them. His leaving was not a simple act of cruelty, though it wounded her cruelly. It was the act of a man who had become desperate for air. And Vivian, left behind, had to carry both truths at once. He had loved her. He had left her. That combination can break a person more deeply than hatred ever could. Because hatred gives the heart something clear to hold. But love mixed with abandonment leaves questions that never stop returning. Was I too much? Was I not enough? Did he remember the beginning? Did he regret the ending? Did he ever understand what losing him did to me? Vivien Leigh was too proud to live publicly as a discarded woman. She had style, wit, and discipline. Even when her body weakened, she could still appear composed. She still had that voice, that elegance, that ability to make people feel they were in the presence of someone rare. But composure is not the same as peace. And behind the polished surface, the old wounds remained. In 1967, her health finally failed. Tuberculosis took her life at only 53, an age that now feels painfully young for someone who had already lived several lives in one. When news of her death spread, the world remembered the films, the beauty, the awards, the famous roles. But those closest to the story knew that another chapter had closed as well. The great Vivien and Olivier romance was no longer a living wound. It had become legend. And perhaps that is why people still return to the question. Before she died, did Vivien Leigh finally reveal the love of her life? Maybe she did not need to. Her life had already revealed it. The answer had been written across years of passion, sacrifice, longing, damage, and memory. Laurence Olivier was not simply the man she loved. He was the man she never completely stopped loving. After Vivien Leigh was gone, Laurence Olivier was left with a silence that fame could not soften. For years, their story had been discussed as scandal, romance, tragedy, and legend. People had judged them, admired them, pitied them, and envied them. But death has a strange way of stripping away performance. Once Vivien was no longer alive, the noise around her changed. The gossip faded. The rivalry faded. The public drama became something colder and more permanent. Memory. Olivier had built a new life with Joan Plowright. He had children, work, status, and the respect of the world. He was no longer the young man who had risked everything for Vivien. He was older now, more guarded, more aware of the damage behind the myth. But when Vivien died, he could not behave as if she had simply been an old chapter. She had been too much. She had occupied too large a place in his life. Whatever he had tried to escape, whatever peace he had found elsewhere, Vivien remained part of him. That is why his final gesture mattered. He went to her home after her death. He paid his respects. It was not a public performance designed for applause. It was not a reunion in the romantic sense. It was something quieter, heavier, and perhaps more honest. A man standing before the remains of a woman he had once loved beyond reason. A man facing the truth that the impossible love of his youth had now become unreachable forever. In that moment, the old bitterness must have felt small. Because what do arguments mean after death? What do accusations mean? What does pride mean? The woman who had once electrified him, frightened him, inspired him, exhausted him, and loved him with a force few people ever experience, was gone. There would be no final conversation that fixed everything. No apology that could heal every wound. No return to the beginning. No chance to tell the young versions of themselves that love alone would not be enough. Only silence. And in that silence, the full tragedy of Vivien Leigh became clearer. She had been loved by the world, but the world had loved an image. It loved Scarlett's defiance, Blanche's fragility, Vivien's cheekbones, Vivien's voice, Vivien's elegance. But images do not need care. Images do not fall ill. Images do not wake in the night frightened by their own mind. Images do not beg to be understood. The real Vivien needed more than admiration. She needed patience, protection, medical understanding, emotional safety, and love that could survive the storm. For a while, Olivier tried. Then he could not. That is not a clean villain story. And that is what makes it more painful. If Olivier had simply been cruel, the audience would know how to feel. If Vivienne had simply been wronged, the story would be easier to tell. But human love is rarely that neat. Olivier was both the great love and the man who left. Vivienne was both the wounded woman and the force that could overwhelm him. Their marriage was both beautiful and damaging. Their romance was both legendary and unsustainable. The world wanted a love story. What it got was something closer to a warning. A warning that passion is not the same as peace. That two brilliant people can adore each other and still destroy the space between them. That fame can magnify every private weakness until a marriage becomes theater. That illness without proper understanding can turn love into fear. And that sometimes the person who changes your life forever is not the person who can stay in it forever. Still, people kept returning to the idea that Vivienne had revealed the love of her life before she died. Perhaps because audiences need closure. They want one name, one sentence, one final confession that makes the story easy to package. But Vivienne Leigh's life resisted simplicity. Her heart was not a headline. Her love was not a clean answer. It was a lifetime of contradictions. She loved Olivier with a kind of intensity that seemed to define her. She depended on Merivale with gratitude and trust in her last years. She loved her daughter, her craft, the stage, and the attention of audiences. She loved beauty, performance, wit, and the fragile power of being unforgettable. But when people ask who changed the direction of her heart most violently, who became the emotional center of her legend, who remained the ghost inside the story even after the marriage ended, the answer still returns to Olivier. Not because he deserved to own her memory, but because he never fully left it. And Olivier, for all his distance, never fully escaped her either. Later reflections on Vivienne often carried sadness, guilt, admiration, and unresolved feeling. He had seen her at heights no one else could touch. He had also seen her in suffering that frightened him. He knew both the legend and the lonely woman behind it. That knowledge is not easy to forget. In the end, Vivienne Leigh's life became a painful contrast between the roles she played and the woman she was. Scarlett O'Hara refused to be defeated. Blanche Dubois depended on the kindness of strangers. Vivienne herself lived somewhere between them. Fierce enough to conquer Hollywood. Fragile enough to be wounded by love. Proud enough to keep appearing before the world. Human enough to break when the lights went out. Before she died, perhaps the truth did not need to be spoken. Everyone who understood her story could see it. Laurence Olivier was the love that made her burn brightest, and also the love that left the deepest scar. But the most painful part of Vivienne Leigh's story is not simply that Laurence Olivier left her. It is that even after he left, the world kept measuring her life through him. Every later relationship, every public appearance, every fragile recovery, every return to the stage seemed to carry the invisible question. Was she over him? Had she healed? Had the great love finally become only a memory? The answer was never simple. Vivienne was not a woman without strength. That is important to remember. Too often, her story is told only through suffering, as if she were merely a beautiful victim drifting from one heartbreak to another. But Vivienne Leigh had fought for everything she became. She fought for Scarlett when Hollywood doubted her. She fought for serious recognition when people wanted to reduce her to a pretty face. She fought to keep working when her health and emotional struggles made every performance more difficult. She fought to remain elegant in a world that enjoyed watching women fall apart. That strength did not disappear because Olivier left. In fact, some who knew her later saw a woman still capable of humor, charm, intelligence, and remarkable professional discipline. She could still laugh. She could still command attention. She could still enter a room and make people feel they had just stepped into a scene from another time. Her voice carried history. Her face carried myth. Her manner carried both pride and damage. But grief can live quietly inside strength. And Vivian's grief was not only romantic. It was the grief of losing a version of her own life. With Olivier, she had imagined a future built from art, love, prestige, and shared greatness. They would be the golden couple of stage and cinema. They would conquer critics together. They would survive scandal because their brilliance would justify everything. They would make the pain of the beginning meaningful by becoming unforgettable together. They did become unforgettable, but not in the way Vivian had hoped. Instead of becoming a perfect monument to love, they became one of the great cautionary tales of fame. Their names remained linked, but with sadness attached. People remembered the passion, then the breakdown, the glamour, then the abandonment, the genius, then the illness, the romance, then the ruin. It was as if the world could not decide whether to envy them or mourn them. That uncertainty followed Vivian to the end. Her final companion, John Merivale, offered something Olivier no longer could. He gave her steadiness, without demanding that she be a myth every second of the day. He accepted the difficult parts of loving her with a kind of quiet dignity. He was present, and presence, in the final years of an exhausted life, may matter more than passion ever did. Yet passion is what history remembers. That is why Merivale often becomes a gentle figure at the edge of the story, while Olivier remains at the center. It may be unfair, but legends are rarely fair. They are built from the strongest emotional images, and Vivian with Olivier remains one of the strongest images of her life. Two impossibly gifted, impossibly attractive people, standing together at the height of artistic ambition, then slowly discovering that beauty and talent cannot protect a marriage from pain. In her last years, Vivian's body became the final battlefield. Tuberculosis, which had once interrupted her life before, returned. The illness was not just a background detail. It weakened her, limited her, and reminded everyone around her that the woman who had seemed so incandescent was still mortal. She had spent a lifetime becoming larger than life, only for her body to pull her back into the most ordinary truth of all. No legend escapes the body. That is what makes her death feel so haunting. She was only 53. Young enough that there should have been more roles, more returns, more chances to be reinterpreted by the world. Young enough that the final chapter still feels unfinished. But perhaps Vivian Leigh's life had always moved at a speed ordinary time could not contain. She had lived with a lifetime's worth of desire, ambition, glory, illness, love, and heartbreak compressed into too few years. When she died, people remembered the obvious things first. Gone with the Wind, A Streetcar Named Desire, the Oscars, the beauty, the romance with Olivier. But underneath those public memories was a deeper question. What had all that glory cost her? The answer is difficult. It cost her privacy. It cost her peace. It cost her the right to suffer without becoming a spectacle. It cost her the illusion that being adored by millions could replace being understood by one person. And perhaps most painfully, it cost her the belief that a love powerful enough to change her life would also be powerful enough to save it. Laurence Olivier did not save Vivien Leigh, but he did something almost as unforgettable. He became the man around whom her most dramatic emotional truth revolved. He was not the whole of her life. He should not be allowed to define every corner of her memory. Vivien was more than the woman who loved Olivier. She was an artist, a mother, a performer, a survivor, and a person of rare force. But when the question is love, his shadow is impossible to remove. Before she died, Vivien Leigh may not have needed to name him in a final confession. The life itself had already spoken. The letters, the risks, the sacrifices, the years of devotion, the collapse, the lingering ache. The way Olivier still appeared whenever people tried to understand her deepest wound. That was the revelation. Not a secret spoken at the end, but a truth written across the entire life of a woman who had once believed love could justify everything.